Okay, the second video is going to deal with something known as the Rostow model and how it connects to the international trade model. So the international trade model is a model that's been used for probably the last 30 to 40 years, if not longer, by many of the world's countries because it allows countries to specialize and promote what they do best based off their climate, workforce, and resource allocation. And so we'll watch these two videos in class over the next couple days. So there was an American economist in the 1960s by the name of Walt Rostow. And what Rostow came up with was this modernization model that says that modern economies over time will shift from agricultural economies, traditional economies, to these high-tech, high-production area economies through a series of stages. And he identified 5 stages of development. The higher the stage you get to, the more developed your economy becomes. And so what I'm going to talk about in the next couple of slides is Rostow's model, some examples of each stage and what each stage means, and how it applies to our modern economy today and how it affects development. So the 5 stages are listed right here, starting with the traditional society. This is the 5th stage. This is like the high mass consumption. If you get to this stage as an economy, as a country, you're considered very highly developed, a more developed core economy. These are the types of jobs. If you remember, we have the 3 main types of jobs: primary sector, secondary sector, and tertiary sector jobs. And if you were in a traditional society, many of the people in this stage 1 would be in primary sector jobs, mainly agricultural, rural settings, with very few people skilled and talented in the secondary and tertiary sector jobs. So some examples of traditional societies: English colonies in the 17th century, medieval Europe. Today, there is no real economy or country in the traditional society. There are still some people in the interior lands of sub-Saharan Africa, the Bushmen, and the Aborigines living in some interior parts of Australia and New Zealand that still exist like this. But for an entire country, no country today is still in the traditional society. This graph looks at the 5 stages, so I'm just going to double back here and just stay with this one to explain the 5 stages. Second stage is called the precondition for takeoff. That's where a country starts to improve its infrastructure. It starts to build better roads, bridges, highways, water systems. It begins to trade with other countries. The United States in the early 1800s was an example of this. It begins to move from an agricultural society to a society that produces more raw materials and manufactured goods. Nigeria today is a good example of this. Nigeria is another up-and-coming economy that's on this track of development. Stage 3 is where you really begin to see entrepreneurship, people taking advantage of a solid government and a good business sector to start their own businesses. Cities begin to really urbanize. You have the growth of industrialization, bigger factories and manufacturing centers. So an example of this would be Japan in the late 1800s, the United States in the mid to late 1800s, as people began to move into more and more cities. So think of stage 3 as more and more urbanization, industrialization. Stage 4 is where you see the improvements in communication, economic growth, social spending on schools and hospitals, and the emergence of new industries. So this could be in the manufacturing, electronics, artificial intelligence sectors, where you see more and more jobs concentrated in like the quinary, quaternary, and tertiary sectors. Germany in the early 1900s is an example of this. Brazil today is a good example of this, as you have advancements in medicine and science and technology. And then finally, stage 5 is the stage of mass consumption. This is the United States, Japan, many core countries today, where you have mass consumption of non-essential goods. Think of all the spending that takes place on phones, electronics, computers, TVs, cars. Those are considered non-essential goods. And a country that's in this stage 5 spends a lot of money on those goods, whether they're made here or they're made elsewhere. This is a country in stage 5 that embraces the international trade model and specializes in what it does best and trades for things it needs. So some examples of groups or regions of the world that chose the international trade model: the Persian Gulf area, also known as the Middle East or Southwest Asia. What they did is they specialized in oil, chemical, natural gas refinement, traded it for money, which they used to improve their airports, improve their ports, their roads, their wells, their mining areas. They created an organization known as OPEC. You might remember that from supranationalism in the last unit. OPEC stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. What they do is they get together and they set the price and supply of oil produced in that region. So they have a good bargaining chip, and that they can decide how much they want to sell their oil at and natural gas at, and how much of it they want to make. So this is a good example of a country or a group of countries that is probably in like that stage 3 to 4 area, where they're identifying resources that they're good at and using them for their benefit. Another group from the Asian continent would be called the Asian Tigers. The Asian Tigers are made up of these four: Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South Korea. These are countries that are in stage 4 of the Rostow model, where they're rapidly developing. They're beginning to use their manufacturing to create new industries. They're making vast improvements in infrastructure like schools, highways, hospitals. Their people are becoming more developed, both educationally, socially, and they're beginning to trade or utilizing this trade with other countries. So in order to get from one stage to the next, Rostow believed that it was important that trade played a big role in this, and that banking centers, financial centers, should try and lend money to help out countries in need. So a country that would say be in stage 1 or 2 would be able to borrow money from places like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and use that money to promote infrastructure, to give tax credits to new businesses, to keep their government from becoming corrupt, to protect laws, to protect private property. This in turn would foster development, foster economic growth, and allow its people to become A, more educated, B, live longer, live healthier lives, and C, have more purchasing power. People would be able to get better jobs, have a higher income, and then buy goods and services not only made in that country, but in other countries as well. This has led to the growth of what are known as transnational corporations. These are companies that have their headquarters mainly in core countries, like I mentioned before, but invest heavily. And by invest, I mean build factories, build farms, build places for production. They invest heavily in less developed countries. So you think about Coca-Cola, you think about Nike, you think about Sony. Many of those companies have built factories or production centers in less developed countries like Brazil, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, Nigeria, based off of what they need to make their product. So, in conclusion, as we wrap up these notes, you should know the difference between the self-sufficiency model and the international trade model. You should know how Wallerstein classified countries in his world systems theory, and what those 3 classifications are, the characteristics of those 3 classifications: core, periphery, semi-periphery. And you should know that the international trade model connects with Rostow's model. And you should be able to summarize for me what Rostow's model is like. I'm not expecting a detailed explanation for each stage, but what you should know here is that each stage is characterized by development, and that the higher the stage, the more developed your economy becomes. And you should know some basic characteristics of each stage. If you have any questions, write them down in your notes, and we can discuss them in class. Thanks.